Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started. Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway. And one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. The sirens started just after midnight and never settled into a pattern. At first, I thought it was a pile-up on the highway or a warehouse fire downtown, something loud but contained. I stood at the bedroom window, watching the red and blue reflections pulse across neighboring houses, expecting the noise to thin out as it always did. Instead, more sirens joined in. Different tones. Different directions. Within minutes, the sound became continuous, as if the entire city had decided to breathe through emergency lights. Mara stirred beside me and asked what was going on. I told her I wasn't sure. That wasn't entirely honest. For weeks I'd been tracking small disruptions, delivery delays, vague emergency alerts that disappeared from official feeds, rumors about hospitals restricting intake. None of it had felt solid enough to act on. Now the uncertainty felt heavier. Headlights swung across our street abruptly. A police cruiser skidded sideways and struck the back of a parked pickup hard enough to deploy the airbags. The officer inside didn't stay to assess damage. He shoved the door open and ran without looking back. I remember thinking that trained people don't abandon vehicles like that. Evan burst through the front door seconds later, slamming it behind him so hard the frame shook. He looked like he'd sprinted the entire way from his apartment 3 blocks over. His hoodie was streaked with blood. "It's not mine," he said immediately, before either of us asked. "They're attacking people, just attacking them. Nobody's stopping." Mara moved toward him, checking his arms, his neck, his hands. He kept talking over her, describing the hospital parking lot, how patients had turned violent, how security tried to restrain them and failed. He said they didn't react when they were hit. He said it wasn't drugs. Another siren cut off abruptly mid-wail. Across the street, Mrs. Calder opened her front door in a robe and slippers, confused and blinking against the flashing lights. She stepped down onto her driveway, looking toward the crashed cruiser. Something came out from behind it. The movement was wrong in a way I felt before I understood. Too stiff at the shoulders, too loose at the neck. It reached her in 3 quick strides. She barely had time to turn before it grabbed her and drove her to the pavement. Mara gasped. Evan swore under his breath. I couldn't look away. The officer who had fled earlier reappeared briefly at the edge of the street, then disappeared again when 2 more figures staggered toward him. None of them moved like people in pain. They moved like they were locked onto a direction and nothing else mattered. Mrs. Calder screamed once. The sound cut off as more bodies converged around her. The sirens continued for another minute, then began to drop out one by one. Not fading, stopping. Silence rolled in like pressure. Evan turned toward the door. "We have to leave. Now." Leave to where? The street was already compromised. Engines roared somewhere in the distance, followed by the unmistakable crunch of metal colliding. A car alarm started and kept going. Mara looked at me because she knew what I had built. The shelter was something I'd constructed beneath the house 3 years earlier, under the excuse of storm preparedness and structural reinforcement. Reinforced concrete walls, independent air filtration, concealed hatch beneath the basement workbench. Mara tolerated it as one of my practical obsessions. Evan used to joke that I was preparing for a fantasy. The fantasy was standing in our driveway. Glass shattered downstairs. All 3 of us froze. Another impact followed, heavier this time. The front door. Evan backed toward the hallway. Mara grabbed his arm to keep him from running blindly toward it. The shape of something moved past the front window, too close, too fast. I didn't debate options. Debate wastes seconds you don't get back. Basement, I said. We moved together. Not panicked. Just fast. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as we reached the bottom of the stairs. Something heavy crossed the living room above us. A lamp crashed to the floor. A low, guttural noise followed, almost curious. Evan hesitated when I slid the workbench aside and lifted the concealed hatch. He stared at the opening like it was proof that I had known something was coming. Inside, I told him. Mara descended first. Evan followed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to appear behind him. I climbed down last and pulled the hatch closed carefully, lowering the reinforced panel into place without slamming it. Footsteps crossed the basement overhead seconds later. Not searching, just moving. The shelter light flickered on, illuminating concrete and steel and shelves that suddenly felt smaller than when I built them. Above us, our front door gave way completely. The sirens were gone now. The city had stopped trying to respond. We stood beneath our own house, listening to unfamiliar movement claim it room by room. That was the moment I understood the shelter wasn't preparation anymore. It was separation. And whatever was happening outside had already crossed the line between disturbance and collapse. The most dangerous phase had begun before we even sealed ourselves underground. You're absolutely right to call that out. The shelter light settled into a steady glow, illuminating the concrete walls and metal shelving in a way that made the space feel both reassuring and claustrophobic at the same time. When I built it, I had imagined calm, controlled use, measured decision-making under hypothetical pressure. I hadn't imagined the house above us already occupied. Footsteps crossed the living room again, slow and deliberate. Something overturned. Wood scraped against tile. The sound didn't have urgency to it. That unsettled me more than chaos would have. Whatever was moving upstairs wasn't panicking. It was simply present. Evan kept looking up at the ceiling like he expected it to collapse. Mara stood near the ladder, listening with the kind of focus that ignores everything else. I checked the filtration unit automatically, watching the airflow indicator stabilize. The system was functioning. The batteries were holding. The math I'd memorized still applied, at least in theory. Then came the knock. It wasn't random impact like before. It was deliberate. 3 sharp strikes against the basement door above us. Mara inhaled sharply. "That's her." Mrs. Calder's voice followed, thin and desperate. She called my name first, then anyone's. The sound carried clearly through the floorboards. Evan's face drained of color. "You saw what happened." "I saw her go down," Mara said. "That doesn't mean she—" A heavy thud shook the staircase above. Something stumbled, then dragged across the basement floor. The door creaked open slowly. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the hum of the air system and Mrs. Calder's uneven breathing above us. Then we heard her again. Closer this time. Trying to move. I felt the decision before I articulated it. If we did nothing and she was still herself, we would be sealing someone out to die within feet of safety. If we opened the hatch and she wasn't, we would be compromising the only barrier we had. The sound of slow footsteps crossed the basement floor towards the workbench. Mara was already climbing the ladder when I grabbed her arm. She looked at me, not angry, not pleading, just waiting to see what kind of person I was going to be in that moment. "Halfway," I said finally. "We open it just enough." I followed her up carefully, easing the hatch upward without letting it scrape. The workbench shifted slightly as we lifted it. The basement air was heavier than it should have been, metallic and damp. Mrs. Calder lay near the bottom of the stairs. Her robe twisted around her legs. One shoulder soaked in blood. Her eyes were focused, tracking us clearly. That clarity gave me enough confidence to act. Behind her, at the top of the staircase, a figure stood crooked in the doorway. Its posture was wrong. head angled unnaturally, shoulders slightly hunched as if joints no longer aligned properly. It didn't rush. It watched. We pulled her towards the opening as gently and quickly as we could. She cried out when her injured shoulder hit the concrete lip of the hatch. The figure at the stairs reacted instantly, descending faster than its earlier movement suggested it could. Evan appeared beside us without being asked, grabbing her legs as we lowered her through the opening. The thing reached the bottom of the stairs just as we cleared her body from view. Its hand struck the side of the workbench, knocking it sideways. I dropped the hatch and sealed it with both hands before it could find the seam. The impact came seconds later, a heavy blow against the reinforced panel. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. Another strike followed, then the scrape of fingers testing edges. It wasn't frenzied. It wasn't even angry. It was searching. We stood there in silence, listening as the pressure against the hatch continued in slow, investigative motions. After nearly a minute, the weight lifted. Footsteps retreated across the basement floor. The door creaked again. Only then did we allow ourselves to breathe fullly. Mara examined Mrs. Calder's shoulder under the light. The wound was jagged but clearly the result of a fall, not teeth. Relief washed through the room cautiously, restrained by the reality of what we had just witnessed. Evan sank down onto one of the cots, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Above us, movement resumed throughout the house. Drawers opening, objects falling, glass shifting under slow steps. We had made the choice to open the hatch. Now there were 4 of us underground instead of 3, and the house above us was no longer empty. The shelter had worked exactly as designed. What it hadn't been designed for was being discovered from the inside. Mrs. Calder's wound was not a bite. That was the first fact we confirmed once the hatch sealed and the immediate surge of adrenaline began to settle. Mara cleaned the gash on her shoulder carefully under the shelter light, flushing it with water while Mrs. Calder gritted her teeth and tried to remain steady. The skin was torn from impact, not punctured. Bruising was already forming along her collarbone where she must have struck the banister. It was ugly, but it was human. Above us, something moved across the basement floor. The sound was no longer muffled by walls and distance. It carried clearly through the ceiling, each step deliberate, dragging slightly before lifting again. The basement door creaked fully open, hinges complaining in a long, thin wail. None of us had touched it since coming down. Evan's head snapped towards the ladder. "You locked it, right?" "I did," I said, though I understood immediately what he meant. The door had been closed. Now it wasn't. The footsteps crossed the concrete floor overhead, slow and exploratory. There was no rushing, no pounding against walls, just movement, the kind of movement that suggested attention rather than frenzy. Mrs. Calder tried to sit up too quickly and winced, clutching her bandaged shoulder. Mara guided her back down gently, keeping one hand pressed against the dressing. I stood near the ladder, listening harder than I had ever listened to anything in my life. The steps above shifted direction. They were coming toward the workbench. The first impact against the hatch was not violent. It was a firm, testing strike that vibrated through the reinforced panel and into my palms, where I rested them against the ladder rail. Dust drifted from the seams. Evan backed into the shelving behind him, knocking a metal can loose. It rolled across the floor with a hollow clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, magnified by fear. The movement above stopped instantly. Silence filled the gap, thick and expectant. Then came the second impact, harder than the first. Not random, directed. The bench legs scraped against the basement floor as weight leaned onto it. I could picture the thing above us, bending, pressing, testing the integrity of the surface separating us. Mara's eyes met mine. "The ventilation," she said quietly. The air filtration unit hummed softly near the far wall. I had built it to operate efficiently, not silently. In normal circumstances, the sound was negligible. In this moment, it might as well have been a beacon. Another blow struck the hatch, followed by the slow drag of fingers along its edge. Nails scraped against reinforced steel. The sound was measured, patient, almost curious. I descended from the ladder and crossed the room in 2 steps to the control panel. Shutting the system down entirely would reduce airflow to near nothing. Keeping it on might be teaching whatever stood above exactly where we were. The scratching intensified. A low, guttural exhale seeped faintly through the seam. I switched the fan off. The shelter fell into a suffocating quiet. Even our breathing sounded intrusive. The air grew warmer immediately, stagnant without circulation. Evan pressed a hand over his mouth instinctively, as if that alone could make him disappear. The hand above scraped once more along the hatch's perimeter. Then it stopped. We waited. 10 seconds passed, then 30, then a full minute. The weight shifted away from the bench. Footsteps crossed the basement floor again, drifting toward the staircase. The basement door creaked as it moved. Only after the sound retreated did anyone move. Mara released a breath she had been holding. Mrs. Calder's eyes were wet but focused. Evan slid down the shelving unit and sat on the floor, his back against the cold concrete, staring at the hatch as though it might explode inward at any second. I turned the filtration unit back on, but only at its lowest possible setting. The hum returned, softer now, but not absent. We would have to ration airflow the same way we rationed food. The breach had not been structural. The hatch held. The concrete walls did not crack. The reinforcement did what it was designed to do. But something fundamental had changed. Whatever was moving in the basement had not stumbled onto the hatch by accident. It had followed sound, perhaps even vibration, and identified a point of interest. That meant curiosity. It meant learning. The shelter was no longer invisible. It was simply defended. Above us, movement resumed upstairs. Drawers opening, glass crunching underfoot, the slow rearrangement of our living space by something that did not recognize it as home. The house was no longer ours. We were living beneath it now, not within it. Evan looked at me after a long stretch of silence. "If they can hear that," he said quietly, nodding toward the filtration unit, "what else can they hear?" It was the right question. I looked around the room differently then, cataloguing not supplies but sounds. The scrape of a cot leg, the click of a battery pack, the shift of fabric. Every object had potential to betray us. The first breach had not broken the barrier. It had broken the assumption that we were hidden. And in a situation like this, being hidden and being secure were no longer the same thing. The hardest part wasn't the impact against the hatch. It wasn't even the realization that they had traced us by sound. The hardest part began hours later, when the movements upstairs settled into a rhythm, and we understood that whatever had entered the house was not leaving. The first night beneath our own floorboards stretched endlessly. The filtration unit ran at minimal power, circulating air just enough to keep us functional without drawing unnecessary attention. Every adjustment we made was calculated, restrained. We moved slowly, we whispered when speech was necessary. Even the smallest gesture felt amplified by the knowledge that something might be listening above us. At some point, the kitchen cabinets were emptied. We heard the doors open and slam, dishes shattering against tile, drawers dragged free of their rails. It wasn't random thrashing. It was repetitive, mechanical, as if the house were being searched without understanding what a search meant. I could map the destruction in my head, the pantry first, then the counter space, then the hallway closet. When the footsteps crossed into the living room again, I recognized the pattern of furniture scraping across hardwood. Mara sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn in, listening as if each sound were being recorded somewhere behind her eyes. Mrs. Calder dozed in brief, exhausted intervals, waking whenever a crash echoed too close overhead. Evan remained alert in a way that looked unsustainable, shoulders rigid, gaze fixed upward. Water began dripping around dawn. A pipe had ruptured somewhere near the kitchen sink. The steady patter filtered through the ceiling, spreading into a thin, persistent rhythm that cut through the quiet more effectively than the earlier chaos had. That sound unsettled me more than the breaking glass. It meant damage that would not correct itself. "This can't go on for long," Evan muttered. "They'll move on." I didn't answer him because I didn't know if that was true. The footsteps slowed as morning approached, then resumed with a different quality. Less frantic, more dispersed. That suggested more than one. We could no longer pretend it was a single intruder trapped inside with us. The weight distribution above us shifted too often, too unpredictably. At midday, something heavy fell directly over the hatch. The bench legs scraped sharply across the basement floor again. We froze instantly, every muscle tightening. The impact was followed by a low, sustained groan from upstairs, a sound that might once have been human but no longer carried intent we could interpret. Mrs. Calder whispered a prayer under her breath. I realized then that we were no longer simply hiding from a threat outside. We were enduring occupation. The house had been claimed, and we were living beneath the claim. That shift in understanding altered the air inside the shelter. It wasn't just about survival logistics anymore. It was about permanence. Every sound above reminded us that the structure we had relied on, our walls, our doors, our roof, was being dismantled piece by piece. Even if the shelter held, what would remain above it? By late afternoon, the dripping water intensified. A pipe must have fully burst. The sound traveled through the floor joists and into the shelter walls, vibrating faintly with each impact. I pictured the drywall soaking, the insulation swelling, the ceiling above the basement softening under sustained damage. Mara noticed the same thought forming in my expression. "Will it affect us?" she asked quietly. "Not immediately," I said, though the truth was more complicated. The shelter was reinforced independently, but prolonged structural compromise could change load distribution. It was too early to calculate fully, too early to admit the possibility. As darkness returned, the movements upstairs thinned but did not stop. We heard dragging along the hallway, then the distinct crack of something wooden splitting under weight. The house was changing shape above us. We ate in silence, rationing without formally declaring that we were rationing. No one said the word weeks, but it hung there anyway. Mrs. Calder forced herself to swallow a few bites before exhaustion claimed her again. Evan barely touched his portion. The psychological toll arrived before physical fatigue did. Listening without acting erodes something fundamental. Each sound demanded response that we were not allowed to give. It forced us into stillness while our home was rearranged beyond recognition. Just before midnight, a new sound joined the others, scratching within the walls. Not at the hatch this time. Along the interior framing, somewhere between the basement ceiling and the first-floor substructure. Slow, exploratory, patient. I turned the filtration unit down another fraction, though it barely changed the hum. The realization settled heavily over me. The shelter was performing exactly as designed, but it had been designed for temporary refuge. The house above had become unstable territory, and instability spreads. We lay down in shifts, none of us truly sleeping. The home we had lived in for years was being taken room by room, and all we could do was listen to it happen. By morning, the house no longer sounded familiar, and that frightened me more than anything else. By the second full day underground, the air had taken on a weight that couldn't be ignored. Even at reduced power, the filtration system was pulling from limited reserves. I had calculated 3 weeks of survivable circulation, assuming stable conditions above us. I had not accounted for a house filled with decomposing bodies and ruptured plumbing. The smell began to seep downward in faint, almost imperceptible traces, enough to make Mara wrinkle her nose when she thought no one was looking. The generator sat in the far corner of the shelter behind insulated paneling, wired to provide limited electrical continuity if the external grid failed. It hadn't needed to run yet. The batteries were holding. But if the outage extended, and the silence outside suggested it would, we would eventually need sustained power. I had always known the generator would be the loudest compromise in the room. "We should start it before the batteries drop too far," Evan said, pacing the length of the shelter for the 10th time that hour. "Better to keep everything stable." "Stable isn't the same as quiet," I replied. He gestured towards the ceiling. "They're already here." That was true, but proximity didn't eliminate risk. Noise teaches location. Location invites repetition. Repetition becomes pattern. Mara listened to both of us without speaking, her focus split between the filtration gauge and the sounds drifting down from above. Movement upstairs had grown less chaotic, but more consistent. Furniture shifted occasionally. The broken pipe continued dripping, though more slowly now. At least one body still dragged itself across the floor at intervals, its rhythm distinct and increasingly familiar. Mrs. Calder remained seated on her cot, pale but alert. "How loud is it?" she asked. "Loud enough," I answered honestly. I had built the shelter with sound dampening in mind, layering insulation and reinforced framing to absorb vibration. But no system is perfectly silent. A generator has a heartbeat, and heartbeats carry. By late afternoon, the battery indicator dipped into the threshold I had labelled caution years ago, impermanent marker. The choice could no longer be postponed without consequence. "We run it for a short cycle," I said. "Low output, just enough to recharge the reserves." Evan nodded immediately, relieved by decisive action. Mara hesitated only briefly before agreeing. I primed the generator carefully, checking connections twice, ensuring exhaust routing remained properly sealed. When I flipped the switch, the engine caught with a restrained but unmistakable growl. The vibration hummed through the floor, subtle but present. We all went still. Above us, the house remained unchanged for several seconds. Then the footsteps shifted. Not rushing, not crashing. Redirecting. The movement upstairs grew more concentrated above the basement area. Something heavy crossed the living room and paused directly overhead. Another joined it. The faint scrape of feet against hardwood aligned precisely with the location of the workbench. Evan swallowed. "They hear it. They feel it," I said quietly. The engine's steady rhythm continued, low but persistent. I watched the charge indicator climb gradually, calculating how much gain justified how much risk. A sudden impact struck the floor above the hatch, harder than any previous test. The bench legs scraped violently across concrete. A second impact followed almost immediately, then a third, faster this time. Mara moved towards the ladder instinctively before stopping herself. Mrs. Calder pressed her hands over her ears. The generator's vibration became a liability I could feel in my teeth. I cut the power. The engine sputtered once and died. The silence that followed rang louder than the machine had. Above us, the pounding continued for several seconds, as if momentum needed time to exhaust itself. Then it slowed into exploratory scratching again. We waited, barely breathing. Gradually, the movement dispersed. The footsteps retreated across the basement ceiling, then toward the stairs. The house settled into its uneasy rhythm once more. The battery indicator showed partial recovery, not enough to justify what we had just revealed. I recalculated silently, adjusting expectations downward. "We can't run it again," Mara said, not as a question. "Not like that," I replied. Evan stared at the darkened generator as if it had betrayed him. "So what? We just sit here in the dark?" If we have to, I said. The reality was clearer now than before. Every system I had built to preserve our lives carried its own signature. Light, airflow, vibration. Each one risked drawing attention in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. The generator had solved one problem and created another. We would have to ration not just food and air, but electricity itself. Short bursts, carefully timed only when ambient noise above masked our own. Storms, perhaps. Structural shifts. Anything that offered acoustic cover. The most dangerous phase of the outbreak wasn't the first night of chaos. It was this: learning which parts of preparation could survive exposure and which ones turned into beacons. As night fell again, we sat in near darkness, listening to the house adjust around us. The shelter remained intact, but its margin for error had narrowed. The generator stayed silent, and so did we. By the third day underground, the pressure inside the shelter had changed. The fear was still there, but it had settled into something heavier and more complicated than panic. It wasn't just the presence of infected upstairs that wore on us. It was the confinement, the repetition, the sense that time had stopped moving while the house above us continued to deteriorate. The air filtration system ran at reduced power, the generator remained silent, and every decision revolved around minimizing sound. We were surviving, but survival had narrowed into a routine that left very little room for control. Evan struggled with that more than the rest of us. He had always been the kind of person who dealt with uncertainty by acting, not waiting. Sitting still while our home was slowly dismantled above us was something he could tolerate for a few hours, maybe a day. By the third morning, it was visibly wearing on him. He stopped pacing and instead watched the ladder as though it were an unfinished sentence. He asked careful questions at first, whether the movement upstairs sounded less frequent, whether the water dripping from the broken pipe had stopped entirely, whether silence might mean the infected had drifted elsewhere. I answered each one honestly, which meant admitting I didn't know. That uncertainty bothered him more than the danger itself. Late that evening, while Mara was rechecking Mrs. Calder's bandage and I was reviewing our supply counts for the third time that day, Evans said quietly that we couldn't stay blind forever. He argued that we needed information, that staying underground indefinitely without knowing what conditions looked like above was its own form of risk. He wasn't wrong in principle, but timing mattered. The infected had shown clear sensitivity to vibration and mechanical sound. We had already learned that much. I told him we would reassess in the morning. He nodded, but the nod didn't reach his eyes. It was during my watch shift that I noticed something off. The filtration unit's hum remained steady, and the house above was relatively quiet. Just occasional shifting and distant movement. But there was another sound beneath that. A faint scrape of metal that didn't belong to the rhythm we had established. I turned toward the ladder and saw immediately that the workbench above had shifted slightly. The hatch was not fully open, but it was no longer seated perfectly in its frame. My stomach dropped. I moved quietly and climbed the ladder without rushing, forcing myself to control each step so it wouldn't echo. When I reached the top, I saw Evan crouched in the basement space, leaning just far enough past the workbench to peer toward the staircase. He had opened the hatch only a few inches, but in that environment a few inches might as well have been a door. He turned when he sensed me behind him. His expression wasn't reckless. It was desperate. "It's quiet," he whispered. "I just need to see." I followed his line of sight towards the stairs. The basement was dim, lit only by ambient spill from broken fixtures upstairs. There were smears along the concrete that hadn't been there before. One of them ran directly beneath Evan's foot. When he shifted his weight, I saw the bottom of his shoe clearly. It was damp and darkened. Not fresh blood. Thicker, drying, but still present. He hadn't realized it when he stepped down from the shelter. The contamination wasn't catastrophic, but it was unnecessary. A shape moved at the top of the stairs just then, subtle but unmistakable. Something stood in the doorway, not charging, not searching frantically, just present, the kind of presence that reacts to disturbance. I pulled Evan back down immediately and reseated the hatch with as little noise as possible. The workbench slid back into place with a muted scrape. We stood still beneath it, listening. Footsteps descended halfway down the stairs, then paused. The infected did not slam against the hatch this time. It lingered, as if reconsidering what it had sensed. After nearly a full minute, it retreated again. When we turned around, Mara was already on her feet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at Evan's shoe, then at me, and understood immediately what had happened. Mrs. Calder sat upright on her cot, hands clasped tightly together. Evan removed the shoe without being told. The sole left a faint mark on the concrete floor of the shelter before he lifted it away. Mara disinfected the area thoroughly and sealed the shoe inside one of the emergency containment bags I had stored years ago with little expectation of using them. The confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was sharp. Evan defended his reasoning, insisting that information mattered, that staying completely blind was its own form of recklessness. I didn't disagree with the logic in theory, but I reminded him that our survival depended on remaining undetected. The infected upstairs had already demonstrated their ability to respond to vibration and sound. Opening the hatch, even briefly, introduced both. What unsettled me most was not the near exposure, but the pattern it revealed. Confinement changes people. It shifts judgment slowly, convincing you that small risks are justified because the larger threat feels constant. Evan hadn't acted out of stupidity. He had acted out of pressure. After the argument subsided, the shelter grew quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. Trust had been strained. The ladder, which had once represented safety and access, now felt like a liability. I adjusted the filtration settings again and recalculated airflow margins. Not because contamination from the basement floor posed immediate danger, but because control, even symbolic control, mattered. That night, the infected above moved intermittently, and each sound carried a new weight. We were no longer just managing external threat. We were managing internal impulse. The most dangerous breach we had faced so far had not been structural. It had been human. Evan didn't look at the ladder again before lying down, but I knew the urge hadn't disappeared. It had only been postponed. And postponement, I was beginning to understand, was the defining rhythm of survival in that space. By the fourth day, the silence outside had taken on a different quality. It was no longer chaotic or transitional. It felt settled. The early sirens, the distant collisions, the scattered gunfire that had punctuated the first night. All of that had faded completely. What remained was intermittent movement inside our house, and an absence of organized response beyond it. For a while, I held on to the assumption that emergency forces would regain control once the initial shock passed. Cities do not collapse quietly, and I'd expected some sign of containment. That expectation began to erode when the radio confirmed nothing. I had avoided using it after the generator incident, conserving power and minimizing sound. But uncertainty carries its own risk, and at some point the need for information outweighed the danger of a brief transmission. I powered the handheld unit at minimal volume and cycled through frequencies slowly, careful not to transmit, only to listen. At first, there was only static. Then fragments of broken communication emerged, half sentences, overlapping voices, coordinates repeated without acknowledgement. The words were not coordinated commands. They were fragments of desperation. One transmission mentioned evacuation corridors collapsing. Another referenced perimeter failure at a regional checkpoint. The most telling message was not dramatic at all. A calm voice, exhausted and thin, stated that civilian movement was overwhelming containment zones and that units were being redirected inward. Inward. There was no mention of rescue. No instructions for civilians to shelter and await extraction. No organized reassurance. Just redirection and silence. I turned the radio off before the battery drained further. Mara didn't ask what I had heard. She could read the answer in my face. Evan broke the silence first. They're coming eventually, right? Military, National Guard, something? His question carried more hope than confidence. I don't think so, I said carefully. Not here. Not soon. Mrs. Calder looked down at her hands when she heard that. She had mentioned her son on the second night. He worked logistics outside the city, she said, and would know what to do. Until that moment, I think she believed someone like him would restore order quickly. The house above us creaked as weight shifted across the hallway. The infected were still there, still occupying the structure in small, persistent ways. Their presence no longer felt temporary. It felt habitual. The absence of military response altered something fundamental in the room. Up until then, even subconsciously, we had been operating under the idea that our shelter was a bridge between crisis and restoration. 3 weeks of supplies had been calculated under the assumption that normal systems would reassert themselves within that time frame. Without that expectation, 3 weeks became an arbitrary number. What does that mean for us? Mara asked quietly. It means we stop waiting, I replied. Waiting implies an end point. Survival without external intervention requires a different mindset. It demands long-term resource planning, stricter rationing, and emotional recalibration. The shelter was no longer a temporary refuge from chaos. It was our primary environment. Evan absorbed that differently than Mara did. She shifted immediately into practicality, asking about food adjustments, water usage, and battery rotation. Evan withdrew slightly, staring at the sealed generator, as if it represented a future we were now abandoning. Above us, a new sound emerged. Wood splintering near the back of the house. It wasn't the random breakage of objects being knocked over. It was structural, like weight pressing against something that had weakened over time. The infected were not coordinated, but gravity and repetition were working in their favor. I recalculated in my head. Food could stretch beyond 3 weeks if portions were reduced gradually. Water was less flexible but manageable. Airflow remained the limiting factor, especially if decomposition upstairs intensified. Mrs. Calder spoke for the first time in several minutes. If no one's coming, she said slowly, then we're not hiding from a wave. We're hiding from a tide. Her phrasing was accurate. Waves crash and retreat. Tides settle and redefine boundaries. That evening we adjusted our routines formally for the first time. Meals were reduced by a measurable margin. Watch shifts were extended slightly to preserve battery use during lighting cycles. Conversation grew quieter, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. The military never came. There were no helicopters overhead, no armored vehicles clearing streets, no coordinated sweeps. Whatever had happened in the city had overwhelmed containment faster than response could scale. The infected upstairs remained, moving less frequently now but not disappearing. Their persistence reinforced the truth the radio had delivered. This was not a short-term breakdown. It was a systemic failure. As darkness settled again, I lay awake longer than usual. The shelter had been built for crisis management. Now it had to support endurance. The difference between those two things is psychological before it is logistical. Crisis expects rescue. Endurance expects nothing. By the 5th day, we had begun to recognize patterns in the sounds above us. The infected no longer moved constantly through the house. Their presence came in intervals, periods of scraping, dragging, or slow wandering followed by stretches of relative quiet. That rhythm, unsettling as it was, had at least become predictable. What unsettled me that afternoon was a new sound that did not fit the pattern. It began as a faint vibration beneath the concrete floor of the shelter, subtle enough that I thought at first it might be residual plumbing pressure shifting through the damaged pipes. But the vibration came again, this time accompanied by a dull, hollow thud that seemed to originate not from the ceiling above, but from below and slightly beyond the reinforced wall, along the east side. I stood still and listened carefully. Mara paused mid-sentence, watching my expression change. Evan straightened in his seat. "There," I said quietly. A slow scraping noise followed, not overhead but beneath the wooden subfloor of the first level, somewhere within the crawl space between the foundation and the main framing. It wasn't loud. It was exploratory, uneven, as though something was pressing upwards and encountering resistance. The shelter had been built within the existing basement footprint, but the older sections of the house still had partial crawlspace cavities along the perimeter where previous renovations had left voids. I had reinforced the primary support beams years earlier, but I had not designed the structure to withstand persistent force from within those cavities. The scraping continued, moving laterally along the underside of the floorboards. Dust drifted faintly from one corner seam of the shelter ceiling. It was not enough to indicate structural failure, but it was enough to confirm proximity. "They're underneath?" Evan asked, his voice tighter than usual. "Not fully," I replied. "They're in the crawl space," which meant they had followed scent or vibration through gaps in the foundation vents or weakened exterior panels. The house had become permeable in more ways than one. The problem was not immediate collapse, it was repetition. The infected did not need intent to cause damage. Repeated pressure against wood and weakened framing could compromise support over time. If the floor above the shelter shifted significantly, the load distribution would change. Mara moved closer to Mrs. Calder, instinctively creating distance from the wall where the sound concentrated. Mrs. Calder's eyes tracked upward and then downward, as if trying to locate the movement spatially in her mind. The scraping intensified for several seconds, followed by a dull impact that made the concrete floor vibrate faintly beneath our feet. The sound was not coordinated, but it was persistent. I retrieved the structural reinforcement kit I had stored along the back wall. Steel brackets, expandable anchors, and a compact impact driver that could operate briefly without significant noise. Using it carried risk, but doing nothing carried more. If we reinforce the east beam supports, it reduces the chance of flex, I explained quietly. But I'll have to work quickly. Evan volunteered to assist without hesitation this time. The earlier incident had tempered his impulse. Now it manifested as controlled focus. He handed me brackets and anchors as I secured additional supports along the load-bearing junctions of the reinforced ceiling frame. Each controlled burst of the driver was short and deliberate, timed between the heavier scrapes above to mask the sound. The infected continued pressing intermittently against the floorboards. Once, a section of wood cracked sharply, followed by a cascade of dust that drifted down through a seam near the ventilation duct. Mara stiffened but remained steady, holding a flashlight in position so I could see clearly. The work took less than 10 minutes, though it felt longer. When I finished the final anchor and stepped back, the reinforced beam held firm even as another dull impact landed above it. The shelter did not shift. The scraping eventually moved farther along the perimeter, migrating toward the back of the house. Whether drawn by scent, sound, or simple wandering, the infected in the crawl space did not remain fixed on our location indefinitely. But the message was clear. The threat was no longer confined to rooms and hallways. It had extended into structural voids we had not anticipated needing to defend. The house above us was decaying from both occupancy and pressure, and the spaces within its frame were becoming pathways. When the sounds subsided again, the silence felt thinner than before. Evan wiped dust from his hands and exhaled slowly. So they're not just upstairs. No, I said. They're wherever space allows them to be. Mrs. Calder closed her eyes briefly, absorbing that reality. Mara remained composed, though I could see the calculation in her expression. How long could Wood withstand that kind of stress? How many points of weakness existed that we could not see? We resumed our positions quietly, but the psychological shift lingered. The shelter was reinforced concrete and steel, but it still relied on the integrity of the structure above it, and that structure was no longer stable in the way houses are meant to be. The infected in the crawl space did not breach the shelter that day, but they reminded us that protection was relative, and relative safety requires constant adjustment. The first hint was subtle enough that I questioned whether it was real. By the 6th day, the air inside the shelter had begun to carry a faint sweetness beneath the filtered circulation. Something heavy and unfamiliar that didn't belong to concrete or stored supplies. At first, I attributed it to the stagnant water upstairs or damp insulation. But as the hours passed, the odor grew more distinct, sharper at the edges, clinging to the back of the throat in a way that no plumbing leak ever had. Mara noticed it without saying anything. She adjusted the filtration intake slightly and replaced one of the pre-filters ahead of schedule. The replacement helped, but only briefly. The smell returned, stronger than before. "It's coming through the vents," Evans said finally, breaking the silence none of us wanted to disturb. He was right. The shelter's ventilation system drew air from concealed intake points along the exterior foundation and exhausted through filtered ducts. It was designed to circulate safely in most emergency scenarios. It had not been built to handle prolonged decomposition directly above it. Upstairs we had heard less movement in the past day. That quiet had seemed like progress. Now it felt like something else entirely. Mrs. Calder turned her face away and pressed a cloth lightly over her nose. "It's in the walls," she murmured. The reality settled slowly but firmly. The infected inside the house were no longer moving consistently. Some had likely fallen where they stood. Others may have collapsed after injury. Without maintenance of the broken plumbing, and with rising indoor temperatures, the environment above us had begun to change. Decomposition was no longer theoretical. The shelter remained sealed, but air exchange was unavoidable. Completely shutting down ventilation would buy temporary relief at the cost of breathable atmosphere. Running it as designed meant filtering air that carried organic decay. I recalibrated airflow again, increasing internal circulation while reducing external intake marginally. It was a compromise, one that would slightly diminish the oxygen exchange, but reduce the rate at which contaminated air entered. Above us, a faint, shifting noise returned briefly near the hallway. It sounded weaker than before, slower and irregular. Then it stopped. The smell intensified over the next several hours. Evan grew restless again, not from confinement this time, but from the implication. "If they're dying," he said, "that means it's ending." "It means they're decomposing," I replied evenly. "That's not the same thing." Mara looked at me, understanding what I didn't need to say aloud. Decomposition upstairs would attract other scavengers. It would compromise structural materials. It would alter air quality further. It might even draw additional infected from outside if the scent carried through broken windows or foundation gaps. By evening, the odor had deepened enough that we adjusted our meal schedule, eating smaller portions and drinking more water to counter nausea. Mrs. Calder struggled the most. She had already been weakened by her injury and the emotional toll of confinement. Now the environment itself was turning hostile in a new way. "We have to vent it," Evans said quietly. He wasn't wrong. If the upstairs windows remained partially intact, stagnant air might be trapping most of the decomposition within the house. Opening an exterior access point, carefully and briefly, could allow natural airflow to disperse some of it, but doing so would require accessing a secondary vent shaft located near the outer wall of the basement, one that connected indirectly to the crawl space. The risk was obvious. Venting meant exposure, however controlled. We debated in low voices for nearly half an hour. In the end, the choice came down to sustainability. Prolonged inhalation of filtered but contaminated air would weaken us gradually. A brief, calculated exposure carried immediate risk but potential long-term relief. I chose the latter. With Evan assisting and Mara monitoring the ladder, I accessed the outer vent channel and loosened the sealed cover just enough to allow crossflow. The process was slow and deliberate. We timed it during a period of relative quiet above, when no movement suggested active presence. When the cover shifted, a rush of stagnant air escaped through the duct, carrying with it the full force of the odor we had been filtering in diluted form. Even through masks, the intensity was unmistakable. We held steady, allowing external air pressure to equalize and circulate through the house's broken upper structure. For several long minutes, we listened for reaction. No sudden pounding followed. No redirected footsteps. The infected above were either too weakened to respond or no longer capable of doing so. After a controlled interval, I resealed the vent and secured the housing. The air inside the shelter gradually felt lighter, though not clean. It was enough. That night, the house above us remained quieter than at any point since the outbreak began. The occasional creak of settling wood replaced the persistent dragging we had grown accustomed to. The smell lingered, but it no longer intensified. The cost of survival had shifted again. We were no longer merely avoiding the infected, we were managing the aftermath of their presence. The house was transitioning from battleground to decay site, and we were living directly beneath it. As I lay awake, listening to the new kind of silence overhead, I understood something unsettling. The most dangerous phase of the outbreak was not defined only by attack or pursuit. It was defined by what remained when movement stopped, and what remained was unstable in ways I was still calculating. The change in Mrs. Calder did not happen suddenly. It began with small refusals, half portions left unfinished, water sipped but not swallowed fully, a quiet "I'm not hungry" delivered without argument. In a confined space where every resource was measured and accounted for, even subtle shifts were visible. Mara noticed first, as she had taken responsibility for tending to Mrs. Calder's injury and keeping her steady through the long hours underground. By the 7th day, Mrs. Calder had begun turning her face away from meals entirely. The air inside the shelter had improved somewhat after venting, but the memory of the smell lingered. It had left an imprint that made appetite feel unnatural. Still, the rest of us forced ourselves to eat, understanding that weakness would compound quickly if we didn't. Mrs. Calder seemed to detach from that logic. "I'm fine," she would say quietly when Mara placed a portion in front of her. "Save it." At first, I interpreted it as guilt. She had not planned to be part of this shelter. Her presence meant fewer reserves for everyone. But when I tried to reassure her that the calculations accounted for 4 people, she only nodded without engagement. Above us, the house had grown quieter in recent days. The infected that once moved with persistence now seemed absent or immobile. The structural noises remained, occasional settling, distant creaks, but the dragging and scraping that had dominated our first nights had diminished significantly. The quiet should have felt like relief. Instead, it created a vacuum in which thoughts grew louder. Mrs. Calder began speaking about her son more frequently. She described his job in logistics, the way he organized distribution networks during regional storms. She spoke about how he always planned ahead, how he believed systems could recover from anything if managed properly. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a steady, distant tone that felt more like memory than expectation. "He'll know what to do," she said one evening, though she no longer framed it as a promise of rescue. It sounded more like a statement about a world that no longer intersected with ours. Mara sat beside her gently. "You need strength," she reminded her. "We all do." Mrs. Calder smiled faintly but did not lift the food. The physical consequences of reduced intake appeared quickly. Her movements slowed. The healing in her shoulder stalled slightly. She tired more easily during watch shifts and eventually stopped volunteering for them altogether. In a shelter environment where contribution equaled morale, her withdrawal had weight beyond nutrition. Evan struggled with it in his own way. He tried once to lighten the mood, telling her stories about childhood mishaps, trying to provoke even a small laugh. She listened politely, but the effort seemed to exhaust her further. I recalculated our food supply that night and adjusted projections quietly. If she continued refusing rations, the numbers technically improved for the rest of us. The practicality of that realization unsettled me more than the loss itself. Confinement does strange things to perception. The mind narrows toward immediate survival metrics. Calories become currency. Strength becomes inventory. I had to remind myself that we were not simply managing resources. We were managing people. On the 9th day underground, Mrs. Calder pushed her plate away completely and did not reach for it again. She sat upright on her cot, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something beyond the concrete walls. "It's quiet," she said. "It is," Mara replied softly. "Too quiet, Mrs." Calder continued. "When storms pass, there's always cleanup. Always someone outside moving. This," she gestured vaguely upward, "this isn't cleanup." No one responded immediately because there was nothing to add. Later that evening, I checked her pulse discreetly. It was steady but weaker than before. Dehydration had not set in yet. She continued to drink water. It was nourishment she refused, not survival entirely. The absence of movement above us made her withdrawal more pronounced. Without the external threat demanding constant vigilance, the psychological burden of what had happened settled fully. She had watched her street collapse in minutes. She had seen neighbors fall. The shelter protected her body, but it did not shield her from memory. Mara tried again the following morning, this time sitting with her longer, speaking not about survival but about routine, about the garden Mrs. Calder had tended every spring, about the color of the roses along the fence line. For a moment, Mrs. Calder's eyes sharpened, and she described the exact placement of each bush, the way sunlight reached the corner of the yard in late afternoon. Then her expression dimmed again. By the 10th day, she was eating only a few bites at a time, enough to delay decline but not reverse it. The rest of us adjusted silently, reducing portions slightly so that she would not feel the imbalance. No one mentioned it directly. The house above remained quiet, except for occasional settling. The most dangerous phase of the outbreak had shifted again. It was no longer defined solely by external threat or structural instability. It was the slow erosion of will under prolonged isolation. And unlike a breach or a generator failure, that kind of damage could not be reinforced with steel. The fire started somewhere down the block, long before we understood what was happening. At first, it was only a faint change in the air, something sharper than decay, something dry and acrid that cut through the filtered circulation. I assumed it was lingering from inside our own house, perhaps insulation finally catching under prolonged stress. But within minutes, the smell intensified, and the temperature inside the shelter shifted almost imperceptibly upward. Evan noticed it at the same time I did. He didn't speak, but his eyes lifted towards the ceiling. Mara stood slowly, already calculating what that change meant. Then came the sound. It wasn't a crash or a sudden impact. It was a sustained crackling, distant but distinct, layered beneath the familiar creaks of settling wood. Fire doesn't move like infected footsteps. It consumes methodically, gaining strength with each second. I climbed halfway up the ladder and listened at the hatch. The house above us was quiet, too quiet. No dragging, no wandering. The infected had either decomposed beyond movement or shifted elsewhere. The crackling sound, however, was growing stronger. From outside, a neighboring house must have ignited, likely from unattended electrical systems or a ruptured gas line. With no firefighting response and no containment, flames would spread unpredictably from structure to structure. Our house, already compromised by broken windows and damaged framing, was vulnerable. Mara joined me at the ladder. "Is it here?" "Not yet," I said, though the word felt temporary. Within 10 minutes, the temperature in the basement rose noticeably. Concrete retains heat differently than wood, but prolonged exposure would eventually transfer through the foundation. The ventilation system began drawing warmer air. Then something above us shifted violently. A section of roof framing gave way with a sharp, splintering crack, followed by the heavy thud of collapse somewhere toward the back of the house. Dust cascaded down through unseen seams. The house was no longer just deteriorating. It was destabilizing. "Daniel," Mara said firmly. I descended the ladder and retrieved the structural brace kit again. The reinforced shelter was designed to withstand significant load, but not the full collapse of an entire structure without redistribution of weight. If the first floor gave way directly over the shelter, the load could exceed design limits. Another crash echoed overhead, closer this time. The living room, if my mental map was accurate. Evan moved towards the east wall instinctively, steadying himself as if bracing for impact. Mrs. Calder sat upright on her cot, eyes wide but silent. The temperature rose another degree. Smoke began seeping faintly through the ventilation intake despite filtration. Not thick yet, but present. "We may have to shut it down," Mara said. "If we do that, air will drop fast," I replied. A sudden, deafening crack split the air as a major support beam above us fractured under combined fire and structural stress. The impact that followed shook the shelter violently. One of the ceiling seams split slightly, and a fine rain of plaster dust fell across the floor. For a brief second, I believed the shelter would fail entirely. It didn't. The reinforced beams held, but the load had shifted. I felt it in the vibration beneath my feet, a new distribution of weight pressing unevenly across the ceiling. I moved quickly to reinforce the central support brackets, tightening anchors and securing additional braces along the main load-bearing frame. Evan assisted without hesitation, handing tools precisely when needed. Above us, flames crackled louder now, close enough that the air temperature continued rising steadily. Smoke concentration increased despite filtration. "We can't stay if it spreads directly overhead," Mara said, her voice controlled, but urgent. She was right. The shelter was insulated, but prolonged exposure to high heat could compromise seals and oxygen levels. Our refuge was not fireproof against a full structural burn. The sounds above shifted again. Another collapse, this time toward the front of the house. A window likely gave way, altering airflow patterns. The crackling intensified, then gradually began to drift laterally rather than downwards. The fire was spreading across structures, not settling directly on top of us. We waited in tense silence for the next several minutes, monitoring temperature and airflow. The shelter held steady. The ceiling did not sag further. The vibration stabilized into a constant but manageable pressure. After nearly an hour, the crackling diminished slightly. The fire had likely consumed the neighboring house and moved past our roof line, drawn toward other fuel sources downwind. The immediate threat receded. But the damage remained. Our house had partially collapsed. The roof structure and at least one major beam were compromised. Even if flames had not fully engulfed it, the integrity of the building above us had been permanently altered. Evan leaned against the wall, breathing hard but steady. Mara checked Mrs. Calder for signs of smoke inhalation. I stood in the center of the shelter, listening to the new, unfamiliar pattern of settling overhead. The home we had known was no longer intact. Even if the infected were gone, even if the fire had passed, the structure itself was now unstable. The shelter had survived the collapse. But it was no longer beneath a house. It was beneath what remained of one. In the days after the fire, the house above us felt altered in a way that was difficult to describe. The structure no longer insulated sound properly. Wind moved through broken sections of roof and fractured framing, producing low, irregular noises that took time to interpret. It became harder to distinguish between environmental shifting and actual movement. The infected that had once occupied the house seemed largely absent now, though we could not confirm that with certainty. What remained was instability and a kind of hollow quiet that felt less threatening, but more uncertain. It was during one of those quieter stretches that we heard a voice. At first, it blended into the background of settling wood and outside air pressure shifting through damaged beams. The words were faint and distorted by distance, but clearly human. Someone was outside, speaking cautiously, asking if anyone was still alive. The sound traveled unevenly through the compromised structure, reaching us in fragments before becoming clearer as the speaker moved closer to the house. All of us recognized immediately that it was not an infected. The tone carried fear, fatigue, and restraint, qualities we had not heard in days. Evan reacted first, lifting his head and turning toward the ladder without hesitation. Mara remained still but alert, listening carefully to determine whether there were additional footsteps nearby. Mrs. Calder straightened on her cot in a way she had not done in some time. The voice continued, explaining that smoke had drawn them towards the neighborhood and that they were searching for anyone who might have survived. The words were measured rather than frantic, suggesting caution. There were no accompanying sounds of dragging or erratic impact that had once signaled infected movement. Evan argued quietly that we could not ignore someone who might be alone and uninjured. He pointed out that we had benefited from preparation and that others would not have had that advantage. Mara countered that opening the hatch, even briefly, meant risking exposure to conditions we could not assess. The house was structurally unstable, and we had no confirmation that infected were truly gone from the surrounding area. While they spoke, I climbed partway up the ladder and listened closely through the reinforced panel. The footsteps above were steady and deliberate. The person moved through debris carefully, likely navigating the collapsed sections of the first floor. At one point, the basement door handle rattled lightly, not with force, but with inquiry. The caller paused after that and spoke again, this time more softly, as if aware that someone might be nearby. The request for help was direct but not aggressive. There was no immediate sign of secondary movement responding to the voice. The neighborhood remained otherwise quiet. The dilemma was simple but heavy. If we opened the hatch and the situation outside was clear, we might gain information and potentially strengthen our position by cooperating. If infected remained hidden or were drawn by sound, we could lose the only defensible position we had. Silence, on the other hand, would preserve our safety, but at a moral cost that would linger. We remained still for several minutes while the person above waited. Eventually, the footsteps shifted away from the basement door and moved back across the debris-strewn floor. The voice called out once more, weaker now, before retreating toward the street. No infected responded. No additional sounds followed. Evan looked at me, frustrated but contained. Mara lowered her gaze, understanding the weight of the decision even without agreeing with it fully. Mrs. Calder said nothing, though the brief spark of hope that had appeared in her expression faded gradually. We did not open the hatch. The shelter remained sealed, and the neighborhood returned to its altered silence. The choice preserved our position, but it left a quiet residue in the room that none of us addressed directly. Survival had required restraint before. Now it required indifference, and that distinction was harder to carry than the sound of anything moving above us. After the fire burned through the neighboring houses and the infected presence inside ours diminished, the world above us entered a phase that was harder to interpret than the chaos that came before it. The early days underground had been defined by noise, sirens, breaking glass, dragging footsteps, collapsing beams. Now the dominant feature was absence. The house creaked occasionally as it adjusted to its new structural weaknesses, and wind passed through exposed sections of framing, but the constant human-derived movement had faded almost entirely. At first, we treated that quiet as a warning. Sudden silence in an unstable environment rarely signals resolution. It can mean migration, collapse, or consolidation somewhere out of range. We extended watch shifts again and reduced internal noise even further, waiting for some indication that the pattern would resume. It did not. The smell of decomposition, once sharp and persistent, began to dissipate gradually as airflow through the damaged roof increased. That change suggested that whatever bodies had remained upstairs were no longer contained within stagnant air. Whether they had fully decomposed or been exposed to external scavengers, we could not determine. What mattered was that the atmosphere inside the shelter became more breathable without constant adjustment. Psychologically, the shift was more complicated than relief. For days, survival had required constant attention to external threat. Every sound carried meaning. Every vibration required analysis. Without that stimulus, the mind redirected its focus inward. Fatigue surfaced more clearly. Mrs. Calder's decline felt heavier without the distraction of immediate danger. Evan's restlessness returned in a quieter form. Less impulsive than before, but more persistent. Mara adapted by increasing routine. She organized ration schedules with greater precision, assigned cleaning tasks that did not strictly need doing, and structured our days in predictable segments. Structure replaces chaos, but it also highlights how little there is to fill the hours. I began reassessing the shelter's long-term viability. The partial collapse of the house above had altered load distribution permanently. While the reinforced ceiling had held through the fire, the structural margin was narrower now. If additional weather events occurred, heavy rain or strong wind, the compromised framing could shift again. The shelter was stable for the moment, but no longer buffered by an intact structure. The absence of infected movement suggested that the most immediate wave of activity had passed through our area. That did not guarantee safety. It merely implied that density had changed. In outbreaks of any kind, initial surges thin as resources are exhausted or populations migrate. What follows is unpredictability rather than order. One afternoon, Evan climbed halfway up the ladder and listened without opening the hatch. He remained there longer than necessary, simply absorbing the quiet. When he descended, he said that he could hear birds again. That detail unsettled me more than it reassured me. Nature reasserting itself did not mean restoration. It meant the human noise that once dominated the neighborhood had been replaced. Mrs. Calder's condition remained fragile. She resumed eating small portions under Mara's steady encouragement, though her strength returned slowly. Without active threat, the emotional weight of what she had witnessed settled fully. She spoke less frequently now, conserving energy both physically and mentally. The silence forced us to confront a new question. How long could we remain underground without confirming the external environment directly? The shelter had protected us through the most violent phase, but indefinite isolation carried its own risks. Supplies were stable but finite. Structural integrity was compromised but holding. The infected presence seemed reduced but not verified. We discussed the possibility of eventual emergence cautiously, not as a plan, but as a future consideration. Timing would depend on stability. of weather, of structure, of our own physical condition. The mistake Evan had made earlier weighed on those discussions, reminding us that impatience could undo careful preparation. The quiet above us continued for several days without significant interruption. No voices called out again. No new fires ignited within audible range. The house settled into a damaged but static state. The most dangerous phase of the outbreak had not ended with a final confrontation or visible victory. It had tapered into uncertainty. We were no longer reacting to immediate assault. We were evaluating sustainability. That shift required a different kind of discipline, less reactive, more strategic. When I lay awake during those nights, listening to wind pass through fractured beams instead of infected footsteps, I understood that survival had entered a new stage. We were no longer defending against impact. We were preparing for transition. The silence did not promise safety. It demanded a decision. We did not choose the morning in a dramatic way. There was no sudden sign from outside, no clear signal that the neighborhood had stabilized. The decision formed gradually over several quiet days, reinforced by the absence of movement and the slow return of ordinary environmental sounds. Wind through trees, distant birds, the faint settling of debris rather than deliberate footsteps. At some point, remaining underground began to feel less like protection and more like avoidance. Before acting, I reviewed everything again. Structural supports inside the shelter were holding, but the ceiling above had shifted permanently after the fire. The air was stable without aggressive filtration. Our supplies were still sufficient, though no longer abundant. Mrs. Calder's strength had improved enough that she could stand without assistance for short periods. Evan's restlessness had transformed into focused readiness rather than impulsive urgency. Mara's calm had remained consistent throughout, though I could see the strain in the way she monitored every adjustment. We agreed that the hatch would be opened only partially at first. No sudden movements. No raised voices. We would assess the basement before exposing the full shelter. I climbed the ladder slowly, listening through the reinforced panel for several long moments before touching the latch. The house above was quiet, but not empty in the way it had been on that first night. It felt hollow, as if stripped of function rather than occupied. I eased the hatch upward carefully, shifting the workbench just enough to create an opening. Cooler air filtered down, carrying dust and the faint scent of charred wood rather than decay. I stepped into the basement cautiously and paused to let my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through fractured sections of the structure. The space looked altered but stable. Debris covered portions of the floor. The staircase railing had collapsed inward. Sections of drywall had fallen away, exposing framing and insulation. There were no bodies in immediate view. I moved slowly toward the stairs, checking each step before placing weight on it. The upper floor was partially open to the sky where the roof had burned through. Sunlight filtered down in angled beams, illuminating the destruction with an unsettling clarity. Furniture was overturned and charred. Windows were shattered completely. Ash and dust coated nearly every surface. What struck me most was not what I saw, but what I did not hear. No dragging. No low groans. No reactive movement responding to my presence. The infected that had once occupied the house were either gone or beyond motion. Whether they had wandered off before the fire or succumbed to injury and decay, the immediate threat inside the structure appeared absent. I returned to the basement and signaled to the others that it was safe enough to emerge cautiously. Mara helped Mrs. Calder climb the ladder carefully, followed by Evan. We moved through the ruined interior together, stepping around debris and avoiding sections where the floor felt unstable. Outside, the neighborhood was nearly unrecognizable. Several houses had burned to partial shells. Others stood damaged but intact. Vehicles remained where they had crashed days earlier, some with doors hanging open. The street was quiet in a way that felt permanent rather than temporary. There were no visible groups of infected nearby. That did not mean they were gone. It meant density had shifted elsewhere. We stood in what had once been our living room, now open to the sky, and absorbed the reality of what remained. The shelter had preserved us through the most violent phase of collapse. It had done exactly what it was built to do, but it had not preserved the life we had known above it. Mrs. Calder looked towards where her house once stood across the street. Only part of the exterior wall remained. She did not cry. She simply nodded once, as though confirming something she had already accepted. Evans scanned the street with measured caution, not the restless urgency of earlier days. Mara reached for my hand briefly, grounding both of us in the present moment. The decision ahead was not whether to survive underground any longer. It was where to go next and how to move through a world that had redefined itself without asking permission. Isolation had protected us during the outbreak's most dangerous surge, but it was not a permanent strategy. The shelter had been a pause, not an endpoint. We gathered what supplies could be transported safely and prepared to leave the basement behind. The hatch remained open as we stepped into daylight fully for the first time since the sirens began. The most dangerous phase had passed. What remained was uncertain, unstable, and quieter than before. But we were still here to face it,